Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you again. And again, I thank Vasco and everyone at CVM for inviting me to be here. Those of you who know me know that I can talk all day. So having 20 minutes, I will try to honor that. In fact, maybe I'll even end early. But the FINRA Foundation, in addition to working on the National Financial Capability Study, we have a number of grant programs, and we also do our own projects. And one of the projects that's nearest and dearest to my heart is our investor protection campaign. I'm a longtime regulator. I've worked in the securities industry for the securities regulation field for 25 years. And so it's very important to me that investors are protected and that we root out fraud wherever we can. And so I wanted to share with you a couple things that we've learned through that investor protection campaign, particularly research related to emotion and fraud susceptibility, and then some training programs that we put on for first responders to financial fraud. And we work with what we call in the United States the Adult Protective Service, who are really the people that intervene in all the various types of abuse that Gerson was talking about. And we're trying to help them understand what financial fraud looks like, because often it is the instance that it's the caregiver that is engaging in some kind of financial fraud, but there's also evidence that older individuals, particularly people who have accumulated a decent amount of money for retirement, are targeted for financial scams from strangers as well. And so financial fraud can take on a number of different aspects. And we really wanted to explore that deeply and share it with the field, not just with consumers, but the people that interface with those consumers, the Adult Protective Service workers, the police detectives who investigate those crimes or those calls. You know, one of the anecdotes is that if someone comes up to you on the street, maybe they have a knife, maybe they're just threatening, and they say, "Give me your wallet," and they take your money, that's a crime. That no one would think for a minute that that was anything other than a crime. They've assaulted you, they've robbed you, they took your money. But when anyone, and particularly when an older person, becomes a victim of a scam, whether it's a romance scam on Facebook, somebody friended them, they became, lovers virtually, and then the person starts asking for money. You think that person's a fool. You don't think that they were a victim of a crime, and yet they were. And so we try to really demystify for people that aren't in the financial services world what financial fraud can look like. And so I'll tell you a little bit about those training programs. And then there are also some things that FINRA as a regulator is doing to try to protect vulnerable investors. Those are the three things that I'll talk about this afternoon. So first, let's talk about emotion and fraud susceptibility. I loved that Ana Beatrice's research is looking into emotion, and I value so much all the discussion that we're having today on so many different levels about the role of psychology and how it relates to money making. Ultimately, money is incredibly emotional for most people. And when we get into a heightened emotional state, we tend to make less fortunate decisions with our money. And so we recently released some research that the FINRA Foundation worked with the Stanford University Center on Longevity and AARP, which in the United States is an organization that advocates on behalf of people who are over the age of 50. It's a nonprofit organization, very trusted resource. So the researchers constructed an experiment where they wanted to examine the extent to which emotional states could make someone more vulnerable to a fraudulent sales pitch. And so the research was done in two phases, and I know it's difficult to see the chart. I'll walk you through it, don't worry about it, and the research is available with the source from the PowerPoint. But the first phase, we conducted a study on people that were age 65 to 85. And the researchers first confirmed that they were able to induce emotional states, and they induced 2 different emotional states. One was very positive. It was very excited. The person was happy. There was a task that they had to engage in where they were winning money, and so they were feeling really good about themselves. They were happy. The other state was negative. It was anger and frustration. The idea was that they were losing money in this game, and the control was a neutral group. And what we looked at, once we induced these emotional states, we showed these study participants fraudulent advertisements that a federal agency, the Federal Trade Commission, had used in a similar study. And we showed them these fraudulent advertisements to see how likely they would be to purchase or to invest in the opportunity that was being presented to them. One was a purchase, one was an investment, and one was making a charitable contribution to a bogus outfit. And we also asked how much the person believed the advertisement and whether there was any connection between their intent to purchase and whether they believed the advertisement. And the results that we got were fascinating, so fascinating that we decided to see, because we knew that this, what was happening with the older population, we thought, well, let's see what's happening with the younger population. So when we finished looking at a second sample of people ages 30 to 40, we were able to make some comparisons. And the fascinating findings of this study are that older adults are more susceptible if they're induced into a heightened emotional state, whether it's positive or negative. And you can see the yellow line and the red line. The yellow line, or orange I guess it looks, is excitement. So people were more likely compared to the blue control to say, yes, I want to buy, I want to give my money to this stranger. If they were happy, they were even more likely to do so if they were angry, but equally high levels. There's not a statistic difference between those levels. Compared to younger people. Younger people, while there was an interplay with emotion, it was less dramatic. But one of the fascinating additional findings that we found as a result of asking about the credibility is that with younger people, if they intended to purchase, it was because they believed the advertisement. And if they did not intend to purchase, it was because they did not find the advertisement to be credible. But with the older people, even when they felt that this had to be too good to be true, this had to be a fake advertisement, this couldn't be right, if they were in that emotional state, they still said that they intended to purchase. And so this gives us a really interesting view into the psychology of decision-making and into the psychology of the perpetrators of these frauds. Because we know from previous research that we've been doing since 2006 that con criminals, fraudsters, use emotion. They use persuasion to get you to buy into their scam. They become your friend. They do all these things to get you into an emotional state so that you're thinking not with the rational side of your brain, but with the very emotional side of your brain. They call it putting you under the ether. And this tactic we've been testing in different ways over the past 10 years. So we're really in the early days of coming to some conclusions about these relationships and what we can do about it, but just knowing that there is this emotional element to fraud is important. And some of the research that we found, especially with some of the statistics that Jerson was sharing, is really interesting to see because when it came to investment fraud, we saw that the profile of the victim was typically a man over the age of 60, had a spouse or a partner, didn't live alone, had higher levels of education, higher levels of income, more of a risk taker, more self-directed, and often had a negative life event that had happened, the loss of a job, loss of a spouse. So for investment fraud, it was the older guys. And that really debunked this myth of investment fraud victims being gullible, little old ladies living at home, isolated, take a phone call, and lose their money. But when it came to different types of financial fraud other than investment fraud, we saw that in fact the profile was those isolated women, and typically older, women who were more in their 70s and 80s. So it fits very nicely with some of the research that's being done here. And other countries have looked at this issue and are starting to see similar patterns. One of the things that we're doing with the Department of Justice in the United States is developing a taxonomy of different kinds of financial fraud. So understanding the characteristics of each different type of financial fraud. And then the Department of Justice will put into a survey that will be fielded next year some questions that tease out financial fraud. Because in the US, we're struggling for data. We don't have all the data on elder financial abuse. But this taxonomy of fraud and the questions that we've developed and tested will give us more information and more data. So we're hopeful that in the years ahead we'll be able to have some statistics about the incidence of fraud, because we know there's prevalence, but we can't define it. The next thing that I want to talk about is the law enforcement training. There are two programs, and I'll share briefly with you each of them. The first we call Targeting Investment Fraud, and we run it in collaboration with the National White Collar Crime Center, which is a nonprofit organization that trains law enforcement, detectives, police officers, prosecutors, on a wide range of topics, identity theft, investigative techniques for all kinds of crimes, not just financial crimes. But they were interested in building out the book of offerings that they had that related to financial fraud and to financial crimes. And so over the past 4 years, we've done 32 trainings with them, and my colleague Lori Schock, who was on the panel earlier today, has co-presented with me, and her team has co-presented with my team with these law enforcement. We try to be as inclusive as we can. We try to bring in the local prosecutors to give some, recent stories in that particular state or in that particular community that will resonate with the law enforcement that we're working with. And we bring in the state securities regulator and, make a full day of it. It's an 8-hour training. We've reached over 1,200 first responders in 460 different federal, state, and local agencies. So again, law enforcement and prosecution. And it's very interactive. So you learn a lot about investigative techniques, but you also, you do a little bit of role playing so that you can help the community learn how to prevent fraud. A lot of law enforcement agencies in the US have a strong community policing program, and so there's a lot of interest in being able to provide training to the community on how to spot and identify investment fraud. So that's part of why we do it. We also, we did an evaluation recently of this program. So looking back at the first 3 years, we surveyed all the participants. We got a very high response rate, which was very encouraging. But we asked them whether the program was useful to them, if they were applying it in their daily workday, if it helped them with their job performance, if they were interested in follow-on training that would explore advanced techniques. And we were heartened to see that virtually all of the attendants thought it was valuable and that it helped them increase their skill set. 93% almost. 75% said that it helped them in their job, helped their performance, and close to 90% said that they would attend a training. And this was, some of the people had gotten the training 4 years before. So that level of positivity was really gratifying to us. And it was it means that we're going to continue to do this program. But we also reach out to victim advocates. In addition to the adult protective service workers and the other first responders, there are a lot of crime prevention organizations in the US, a lot of counseling organizations that work with victims of crime. And the National Center of Victims of Crime in the US is the partner that we work with on delivering a similar program, but it's tailored for a different audience. We've reached 4,400 victim advocates since we introduced this program in 2013. The idea really came out of the law enforcement training because we would meet with victim advocates, and some of them work at the federal level for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Others are very much, the victim advocate at the local courthouse. But we were able to help empower these workers and equip them with tools to better respond to victims of financial crimes. And we cover a number, not just investment fraud. We cover lottery scams, other types of financial fraud, the email scams, identity theft. And we created a guide called Taking Action, which we've distributed tens of thousands. I think we're over 100,000 distributed. We distributed 8,500 plus so far this year. But people in the community that are able to use these checklists to help them help victims of crime. One of the most important elements, as anyone in the room who has been involved in securities regulation or law enforcement knows, is that when a financial fraud like this, particularly investment fraud, takes place, the money's gone. They're not getting it back. And if they do get it back, it's usually pennies on the dollar. It's pretty rare that there's a full restitution made. And so helping the victim come to grips with that reality and get on the path to financial repair is really important. One of the studies that we did that I would love to share with you, Ana Beatriz, is the one that looked at the non-traditional costs of fraud, because in addition to the money that you lose, you often have to spend money to attempt to get the money back. You might be in a position where you've got to file bankruptcy because you lost money. And there's separately the psychological toll. There's the anger, the shame, the fear, the potential for suicide. So financial fraud is a really ugly, ugly crime. And that's why we want to help victim advocates help victims, because we can't be everywhere. So one of the things that we're doing, though, since we can't be everywhere, is we're trying to change the way the industry operates. And one mechanism that we used to do that was we created a securities helpline for seniors. And we have a call center. Lots of people call that center with questions about investing. A lot of industry members call with, they need interpretation on a rule. This is different from that call center. It's a line that's staffed by examiners, by regulators, people who go to firms and examine firms and really understand the securities laws and rules that the industry has to operate under. And we've advertised this helpline to really, it's run out of our Florida office, which is, it's a highly densely populated with seniors area in the United States. And so far in the past 18 months, we've gotten 7,200, this is actually an older slide, 7,200 calls, and we've been able to get back for the people who call us close to $2.6 million. It's an informal advocacy effort that we engage in. People call us with a problem. Most of the questions that we get really don't have to do with much more than education. We're trying to help the investor understand what happened to them. And with that, we keep a log of the kinds of complaints that we get. And most of them, like I say, are education related, but there are some that relate to certain products or relate to certain issues that wouldn't ordinarily come to FINRA's attention. One of those is power of attorney and how you use power of attorneys and how assets can transfer after death. So it's been a great success, and it's caused us to introduce rules which the SEC, it's currently out for public comment with the SEC, but these rules would protect senior investors by doing two things. It would require the firms to attempt to obtain alternative contact information for an older investor, so for all investors, so that if there is a problem, the firm is able to contact that alternative contact. The person doesn't have to give the information, but the firm is required to seek to obtain it. And then it would allow the firms to pause the disbursement of funds if the firm or the broker has a reasonable belief that there's fraud behind this transaction. One of the things that's been so frustrating for firms under FINRA's rules and securities laws in the US to date is that if a customer orders a particular transaction, the firm is obligated to act on that. So even if the broker thinks that it's a fraud and can't talk the person out of it, they have to execute that transaction. This would allow them to withhold the disbursement of funds so that they can contact law enforcement, they can talk to Adult Protective Services, see if there needs to be a wellness visit, and really try to help the consumer. So with that, I thank you.